Rain hammered against the cracked windows of the old garage, each drop echoing like a drumbeat of something broken. Filey's hands trembled as she crouched beside Max, her police dog, who shivered violently despite the warmth of his fur. The scent of wet concrete and the sharp sting of shampoo burned her nose, a cruel reminder that the thick golden coat that had always gleamed in the sun had been hacked away in jagged, uneven tufts. Someone had laughed while doing it, and that sound, light, careless, filled with cruelty, was still ringing in her ears. Her chest felt hollow, as if the world had been drained of color, leaving only the gray ache of betrayal. Her father's warning echoed in her mind, a distant memory of bedtime stories turned lectures. Some people see power as weakness. You never underestimate a threat. You never. But this was supposed to be a safe space. Max, her partner, her shadow, her best friend, looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes, and her heart shattered again. The neighborhood kids who had done this didn't know that the man who had trained for death-defying missions in deserts and jungles was her father. They didn't know that the consequences of crossing the wrong line could be swift, silent, and devastating. Filey's fingers stroked Max's skin where the hair had been cut too short, and a tear slid down her cheek, catching the dim garage light like a fragile prism. She breathed in, steadying herself, and felt the first flicker of something fierce rise from the pit of her despair. This wasn't just about a dog. It was about loyalty, about protection, about righting something so wrong it would never be forgotten. And somewhere deep inside, she knew that storm was about to hit. The garage smelled like wet fur and bleach. Filey knelt on the cold concrete, her knees pressing against tiny puddles of water that reflected the dim fluorescent light overhead. Max shivered beside her, the sound of his trembling filling the small space like a living heartbeat she couldn't stop. She traced her fingers over the uneven stubs where his golden coat had once glimmered in the sun, running her hand over the skin that felt strangely thin now, almost fragile, as if the fur had been a shield and someone had torn it away. The jagged cuts stung her eyes with tears, the sound of them in her ears louder than the rain outside. Someone had laughed. That laugh, it wasn't just teasing. It was sharp, cruel, carried across the yard and into the corners of her memory. She remembered it perfectly. The high, empty sound that echoed against the walls of her safe little world, turning it into something she didn't recognize. Her heart twisted. Max pressed his head against her shoulder, leaning into her warmth. But even that small comfort felt fragile, temporary, like holding a candle in the wind. Why would they? Her voice broke mid-sentence. She clenched her fists until her nails bit into her palms, tasting iron and fear. The neighborhood, the street she had known since she was a little girl, felt smaller and more dangerous now, a labyrinth of eyes she couldn't trust. Every lawn, every fence, seemed to hold a whisper of the laughter that had hurt Max, and by extension, her. She swallowed, trying to steady herself, and caught sight of the jagged light slanting through the garage window. It painted stripes across the concrete and across Max's trembling body, as if the world itself were marking him, marking her grief. Her father's words came back suddenly, a memory sharp as a blade. Some people see weakness and they pounce. You never underestimate a threat, Filey. Never. She had rolled her eyes at bedtime lectures once, thinking them distant, heroic stories she didn't fully understand. Now, those words were a lifeline, a warning she didn't want to obey but couldn't ignore. She looked down at Max, who was staring up at her with eyes that seemed impossibly wise and sad, and felt a surge of anger and protectiveness that made her chest thrum. Outside, the rain intensified, a drumming rhythm that filled the silence of the garage. The drops slid down the windows in streaks, carrying with them reflections of the gray sky and the world she had thought she knew. Her mind flickered to the kids who had done this. Faces blurred, voices echoing, but the cruelty was unmistakable, each memory a knife twisting in her stomach. Her fingers dug deeper into Max's soft skin, stroking where the fur had been, trying to reassure him herself that this wasn't the end, that maybe there was a way to fix what had been broken. Her phone buzzed on the bench behind her, but she ignored it. She didn't want texts, didn't want calls, didn't want reminders of normalcy when everything felt fractured. Max leaned harder into her, a small, warm weight against her side, and for the first time, she allowed herself to notice the faint smell of wet earth coming through the open garage door. It mingled with the tang of shampoo and the sharper metallic scent of fear in her own blood. The smell grounded her, in a way reminding her that the world was still there, outside the hurt. She traced Max's ears with trembling fingers, recalling the countless mornings she had brushed him, the countless evenings they had run through puddles in the yard. How many times had she counted on him to be steady when the world felt uncertain, and now he was fragile, not broken, but exposed. She could feel every heartbeat beneath his thin skin, feel the shiver that didn't stop even when she held him close. And she realized something terrifying. It wasn't just Max who had been violated. Her trust, her sense of safety, had been carved away by the careless cruelty of others. Her fists unclenched, her nails biting lines into her palms that burned sharp alive. Anger began to rise like a tide, slow and heavy, filling the hollow ache inside her chest. She couldn't undo the haircut, couldn't unsay the laughter that had cut through her world, but she could. Something. She didn't yet know what. She could feel the tension building, a coil tightening in her gut, and she pressed her forehead against Max's damp fur. "I'll fix this," she whispered. The words felt both like a promise and a question, fragile and fierce all at once. The rain softened, or maybe she just noticed it differently now, a gentle patter on the metal roof that seemed almost like a lullaby. Max's trembling slowed just slightly, and she realized that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one rising inside her. The bond between them pulsed in that quiet, drenched space, a tether to something unbroken, something resilient. She could feel it. The anger, the grief, the shame. It was all transforming into something that could move, could act, could strike back in its own way. By the time the clouds outside began to break, letting shafts of weak sunlight pierce the gray, Filey had made a decision. She rose slowly, brushing rain from her coat, and looked down at Max with new determination. His tail gave a small, hesitant wag, like he understood that the tide had turned, like he could feel the protection rising up around him. Her father's voice whispered again in her memory, a low rumble now instead of a warning. "You are stronger than you know." And maybe it was true. Maybe strength wasn't about fighting monsters in jungles or deserts. Maybe it was about standing here, in a small garage on a rainy afternoon, and refusing to let cruelty have the final word. The garage door creaked as she pushed it open, letting the weak sunlight spill in and touch Max's patchy coat. The air smelled of wet asphalt and fresh rain, alive and sharp. She took a deep breath and let it fill her lungs, feeling the edge of fear still lingering but tempered by something fiercer. They stepped outside together, Max's paws squishing in puddles, and for the first time since the morning, Filey felt that maybe, just maybe, they could face whatever came next. Whatever storm was coming, it would find her ready. The street was quiet, too quiet. But Filey's resolve hummed louder than the soft dripping of water from the eaves. She squeezed Max's leash, a small, defiant grip, and let the sunlight touch her face. The day was broken, yes, but so was she, and sometimes broken meant unstoppable. The wind shifted suddenly, sending a flurry of rain sideways across the cracked asphalt, and Filey squinted against the sting on her cheeks. She held Max close, his head pressed to her side, and felt the tremor in his body ripple through her own chest. The neighborhood was silent, almost unnervingly so, as if the world had paused to watch her grief, to weigh it and measure it and see if she could bear it. Every fence, every swing in a yard seemed imbued with a hidden threat. Memories of laughter that didn't belong. She tightened her grip on the leash, knuckles whitening, and let her gaze wander over the houses she had passed 100 times before, but never really noticed. Her father's old Jeep sat at the curb, its matte black frame gleaming wetly in the drizzle. She remembered watching him disappear into missions she didn't fully understand then, a blur of stories, discipline, and distant admiration. Now she understood the weight of it, the precision, the quiet ruthlessness he carried like a second skin. She thought about how he always said courage wasn't about the absence of fear, but about acting when fear pressed against your chest like a stone. The thought made her stomach twist, and somewhere beneath the anxiety, a small ember of determination sparked. Max nudged her hand, whining softly, and she leaned down, pressing her forehead against his damp fur. "We'll figure this out," she whispered. Her voice sounded small in the empty street, but it held a kind of stubbornness she hadn't realized she possessed. She could almost feel her father's presence behind her, the invisible weight of lessons learned from a life steeped in discipline and survival. She wasn't trained like him, wasn't hardened by years of danger, but she had something else, the knowledge that some wrongs couldn't go unanswered. The wind carried a faint smell of smoke burning somewhere beyond the next block, and she flinched. Her mind flickered to the bullies. Faces she couldn't quite place, but voices she could never forget. The thought of them laughing while Max suffered made her stomach churn, a slow rolling tide of anger that pulsed in her veins. She bit her lip, tasting copper, and felt tears threaten again unbidden, and this time she let them rise without shame. They were a mixture of grief, frustration, and something deeper, an understanding that the world was cruel in ways that weren't fair, and that sometimes justice had to be carved out, even when it scared you. Her eyes drifted across the wet asphalt, catching the reflections of streetlights in the puddles, and she remembered her father teaching her to observe, to notice details, to see the world not as it wanted to appear, but as it truly was. She had never thought that would matter in her quiet, ordinary life. But now, every wet leaf stuck to the sidewalk, every uneven brick in a wall, seemed loaded with significance. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was instinct. Either way, it gave her a sense of control, however small, in a world that had suddenly felt enormous and threatening. The rain slowed to a drizzle, leaving behind a mist that wrapped around the neighborhood like a soft shroud. Max shook himself, water droplets flying in arcs, and finally had to laugh, a short, bitter sound that caught in her throat. Even in the midst of grief, life pressed forward, demanded recognition. She reached down, brushing the wet fur from his eyes, and felt the warmth of him against her, solid and steady, reminding her that some connections were unbreakable. Her mind raced through possibilities. She could confront the kids, sure, but the memory of their laughter made her stomach not tighter than fear alone could. No, there was a better way. Had to be. Her father had taught her patience, planning, the power of strategy. Even in moments of anger, he had shown her that impulsive action often led to disaster. She drew a deep, steadying breath, letting the mist cool her flushed cheeks, and began to formulate a plan, not fully formed yet, but enough to give her something to hold on to. Max whined again, a soft, urgent sound, and she realized they had been standing there, frozen, for far longer than she had intended. She led him down the street, paws squishing in puddles, heart beating in tandem with his cautious steps. The houses seemed to watch them pass, the quiet holding a weight she couldn't shake. Every shadow felt alive, every movement in the corner of her eye amplified by fear and vigilance. But fear was no longer paralyzing her. It was sharpening her senses, and she let it. She needed it. A sudden movement caught her eye. A branch scraping against a window, wet leaves shaking in the wind. Her heart jumped, and she glanced around, assessing, calculating. Nothing emerged. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain in a long, measured release. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, but she forced herself to move forward, one deliberate step at a time. Max followed without hesitation, trusting her implicitly, and that trust was a weight she could not betray. By the time she returned home, the clouds had begun to break, weak shafts of sunlight glinting off the wet pavement and wet leaves. She stood at the edge of the driveway, letting the light warm her rain-soaked coat, feeling it seep into her bones. She glanced down at Max, who looked up at her with eyes that carried both fear and unwavering faith. And in that moment, she understood something that fear could not teach her. Courage wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was quiet, patient, and relentless, and it grew in the space between heartbreak and action. Her father's Jeep was still parked where it had been. A silent monument to preparation, to readiness, to the strength that came not from brute force, but from understanding every variable, every possibility. She touched the hood lightly, feeling the smooth metal under her fingers, and made a silent promise. No one would hurt Max again. Not while she could stop them, not while she could act. The storm inside her had shifted, no longer a trembling coil of grief and fear, but a hidden gathering force, waiting for the precise moment to strike. And as she stood there, mist curling around her, sunlight flickering across puddles, Max pressed against her leg, she realized the storm wasn't outside. It was in her, quiet and calculated, and it was ready. The late afternoon sun broke through ragged clouds, casting long, jagged shadows across the wet streets. Filey's fingers tightened around Max's leash, knuckles pale, pulse quickening with each step she took toward the park where the bullies often lingered. The world felt sharper here, each sound amplified. The slap of water against pavement, the rustle of wet leaves, the distant bark of another dog. But it wasn't fear that pulsed through her veins. It was purpose, controlled, steady, coiled readiness. She remembered her father's lessons: observe, calculate, strike with precision, and never let anger dictate timing. Max pressed close, sensing her tension, and she leaned down to whisper in his ear, feeling the warmth of his fur under her fingers. "We go in smart, quiet, precise, just like he would." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the enormity of the moment. Her stomach fluttered with a strange mixture of adrenaline and apprehension, but she drew herself taller, letting the wet grass underfoot anchor her. Every instinct she had, honed by years of watching her father navigate danger, whispered that this was no ordinary confrontation. From the corner of her eye, she spotted them. 3 boys clustered near the swings, their laughter thin and careless, oblivious to the storm approaching. Their hands moved over Max's shredded fur as if to mock what they had done earlier, and a hot, sharp anger flared in her chest. But she forced herself to breathe slow and deep, counting the spaces between each inhalation. Fear would make her sloppy. Anger unchecked would make her reckless. Instead, she crouched slightly, feeling Max tense against her side, every muscle coiled and ready. She crept closer, each step measured, water sloshing softly in the puddles. The boys hadn't noticed her yet, their attention fully absorbed in their own cruel amusement. The wind carried their laughter in broken echoes, and the smell of wet grass and distant smoke mingled with the scent of Max's damp fur, creating a strange, almost cinematic clarity to the scene. Filey's heart pounded in rhythm with Max's quick breaths. She could feel the energy between them, the unspoken communication born of years together. He would follow her lead, trust her instincts, and she would trust his. A sharp snap of a twig underfoot made one boy glance toward her, and she froze, pressing her back against a tree. Shadows stretched long across the ground, blotting out the jagged puddles and making everything appear simultaneously closer and farther away. The boy's expression changed, confusion, then realization, and finally a flicker of fear as he noticed Max's low growl, deep and warning, vibrating in the chilled air. Filey could feel the power in that sound, the bond it revealed, and it gave her the tiniest steadying spark of courage. She stepped forward, voice low but firm. To stop. The single word cut through the quiet tension sharp as glass. The boys froze, shifting their weight, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Max growled again, more insistent now, his body low and ready, ears pinned against his skull. Filey inhaled, feeling the wind whip rain-soaked strands of hair across her eyes, letting it sting and ground her simultaneously. Leave him alone. Now. The tallest boy laughed, a sound that no longer carried the same carelessness. There was a hesitation there, a crack in their bravado, and Filey felt it like a tide breaking. Her pulse hammered, but she let it sharpen her senses rather than cloud them. Every detail mattered, the spacing between the boys, the slick mud underfoot, the way shadows could be used to mask movement, the scent of wet leather from Max's harness. She was small, and she knew it. But smallness could be deceptive if wielded with precision. One boy stepped forward, sneering, but before he could reach Max, Filey's hand shot to her pocket, retrieving a whistle her father had given her years ago. She blew it sharply, a piercing, commanding sound that split the air and froze their movement. Max barked once, a thunderous sound that rolled across the park, and the boys instinctively backed away, uncertainty replacing the arrogance of their earlier cruelty. They hadn't expected her. They hadn't anticipated the bond, the timing, the silent authority in her stance. "You thought you could hurt him and nothing would happen," she said, voice rising, controlled fury vibrating in every word. "You thought I wouldn't notice. You thought—" She hesitated, letting the silence hang heavy and uncomfortable, before continuing, "that he wasn't protected." Max's low growl underscored the warning, and she saw the color drain from their faces. It was subtle, but enough. Fear, even faint, was a language she now spoke fluently. They scattered then, sprinting across the wet grass, slipping and splashing as Max bounded after them, controlled and precise, never striking, just asserting presence and warning. Filey watched, heart racing, as the last boy tripped over the curb and vanished around the corner. The adrenaline surged through her, warm and electric, and yet underneath it all, she felt something quieter, the weight of her own courage, the realization that grief had transformed into action. She knelt beside Max once they returned to the safety of the sidewalk, brushing water from his fur, letting her trembling hands remind her of the bond they shared. "You're okay," she whispered. "We did it." The words tasted of rain and dirt, sharp but honest. Max licked her hand, grounding her, a living reminder that fear could be met with courage, and cruelty could be met with something stronger than anger: strategy, patience, and unwavering loyalty. The sun finally broke fully from behind the clouds, golden and warm, reflecting off puddles like shards of light scattered across the world. Finally felt it on her face, letting it wash over the ache and the tremor in her chest, turning it into something resembling triumph. She realized that protection wasn't always about power or brute force. Sometimes it was about timing, observation, and the courage to step forward when the world seemed too large, too cruel, too heavy. Max rested his head against her knee, breathing steadily now, and Filey felt the tension drain from her body in slow, deliberate waves. She looked down the street, now empty, and felt a new kind of calm. The bullies had been warned, and yet the real storm, the one her father had always prepared her for, was still waiting somewhere, beyond the horizon of ordinary days, and she knew finally that when it came she would not hesitate. Not now. Not ever. The world had shifted slightly in her favor, a quiet victory, and for the first time since morning, she felt something like hope unfurling inside her. The hidden storm she had carried, the simmering, coiled tension of grief, anger, and helplessness, had released just enough to show her the shape of her own courage. And standing there in the golden light with Max at her side, she understood. This was only the beginning. The sky had darkened again, clouds heavy and swollen with rain, as if the world itself had gathered for judgment. Finally gripped Max's leash, feeling the tautness of his body mirrored in her own muscle. Every step toward the park felt heavier, charged with anticipation, the damp air thick against her skin. The smell of wet leaves and earth wrapped around her like a cloak, grounding her, reminding her of the rawness of life and the stakes of the moment. She could hear distant thunder, low and rumbling, a warning that nature itself was attuned to the reckoning ahead. Max's ears twitched, nostrils flaring, sensing the tension in the air before she fully registered it herself. The bullies were there again, sprawled near the swings, their laughter hollow, brittle, as though they sensed their world tipping. But this time, it was different. Filey's heart thudded, but not with fear. An almost electric anticipation coursed through her. She had trained herself in these moments with observation, patience, and the guidance of her father's voice echoing in her memory. A strike with precision, not impulse. Control the chaos. Don't let it control you. She stepped from the shadows, Max following silently, a coiled presence at her side. The boy's laughter faltered, replaced by a sudden, sharp awareness of being watched. Filey could see the shift in their posture, the stiffening shoulders, the twitching fingers that had been ready to mock. It was the first glimmer of fear, hesitant and unsteady, and it ignited something fierce inside her. She drew a slow breath, letting the damp air fill her lungs, tasting rain and earth, the sharp tang of adrenaline. "You," she said, voice low, steady, carrying over the park. "You need to leave him alone." The words weren't just a command. They were a promise, an assertion of the bond between her and Max, a declaration of something that could not be taken away. The boy's eyes widened, their bravado faltering under the weight of her presence. They had mocked before, but this was different. This wasn't a confrontation born of childish cruelty. It was the confrontation of consequence, deliberate, unavoidable. One boy stepped forward, mouth curling into a sneer, and Filey felt the familiar coil of anger rise in her chest. But she didn't act impulsively. Instead, she planted her feet firmly, letting Max shift slightly in front of her, growling low, deep, the sound vibrating in her ribcage. The boy's smirk faltered, and a shiver of uncertainty passed across his face. Filey's eyes narrowed, scanning every detail. The slick mud underfoot, the nearby benches, the sharp shadows cast by the fading light. Every element was a variable she could use, a tool in the orchestration of this reckoning. "You think it's a joke," she said, letting her voice carry over the wet park. "You think nothing will happen. But you forgot one thing." Her gaze swept the group, slow and deliberate. "He's not alone." "And neither am I." Max barked once, thunderous and precise, and the boys stumbled backward, startled, their bravado cracking under the weight of her calm authority. The tallest boy lunged forward, reckless teeth gritted, but Max stepped between them, low to the ground, growl intensifying. Filey moved as she had rehearsed, steady, deliberate, positioning herself to block, to protect, to assert the inevitability of consequence. The boy froze mid-step, unsure whether to advance or retreat. In that suspended moment, Filey felt every heartbeat, every shiver, every tremor of tension crystallize into clarity. She was the shield, Max was the sword, and together they were a force the bullies had never anticipated. A sudden clap of thunder echoed across the park, and the boys flinched, back stiffening. Filey seized the moment, taking a single, measured step forward. Go home," she said, voice steady but cutting, like the rain dripping off the metal swings. Think about what you've done. Think about what it means to cross a line, and then stay out of our lives." Max growled again, closer now, a living echo of the warning in her tone. They hesitated, a tense silence filling the space between the thunder and the falling drizzle. One by one, the boys glanced at each other, unsure, their earlier confidence evaporating in the presence of authority and resolve they had never reckoned with. Finally, with muttered curses and jittering steps, they turned and fled, slipping through mud and puddles, the sound of wet shoes fading into the distance. Filey stood motionless for a moment, letting the release of tension wash through her, a slow, rhythmic exhale that shook her from toes to temple. Max nuzzled her hand, damp nose warm against her skin, and she knelt to brush water from his fur, feeling the small, steady weight of his loyalty grounding her. "We did it," she whispered, voice trembling but soft. The adrenaline still hummed in her veins, but beneath it, a deeper satisfaction settled. A recognition that grief and anger could be transformed into courage, and cruelty into consequence. The rain eased, leaving a wet, reflective sheen across the playground. Shafts of late afternoon light broke through the clouds, painting the puddles in gold and silver. Filey rose, brushing her wet hair from her eyes, and felt the first true clarity of the day. The reckoning was done not with violence, but with precision, presence, and the unbreakable bond between girl and dog. She had faced fear, faced cruelty, and emerged unbroken, her spirit sharper, tempered in the storm. Her father's voice whispered through her memory again, calm, deliberate. "A strength is quiet, power is silent. Courage is knowing when to act at anyway." She smiled faintly, letting the words resonate through her chest, through the rhythm of Max's steady breathing. The park felt different now, smaller, familiar, safe in a way it hadn't for hours. The storm outside had mirrored the storm within, and both had passed. They walked home slowly, puddles squishing underfoot, Max occasionally looking up to ensure she was close. Filey felt the tension drain gradually, replaced by a warmth that was both relief and quiet triumph. She knew this wouldn't erase the memory of cruelty entirely, nor the jagged edges of grief that had opened that morning, but it had transformed something fragile into something unyielding. It had shown her the depth of her own courage and the power of loyalty, trust, and presence. By the time they reached the driveway, the clouds had broken fully, leaving the wet world glinting in the soft, forgiving light of a late afternoon sun. Filey leaned down, stroking Max's fur where it was still ragged, still uneven, and felt a calm settle over her, quiet but absolute. "No one will touch you again," she whispered. Not while I'm here, not while we're together." Max licked her hand, a small, warm affirmation, and she let the sound of the world, the dripping leaves, the distant hum of traffic, the faint calls of birds returning after rain, wrap around them. It was over, for now, but the reckoning had changed everything. She had changed. And somewhere deep in her chest, she felt the pulse of something stronger than fear, stronger than grief, stronger than cruelty, a quiet, unstoppable force that would guide her, protect those she loved, and face whatever came next without hesitation. The morning after, sunlight poured through the curtains in soft gold streaks, brushing across the worn wooden floors and warming the damp spots where Max had curled up the night before. Filey sat on the edge of her bed, still in the clothes soaked from yesterday's rain, and watched him stretch, the remnants of wet fur catching the light. He yawned, long and contented, and for the first time in hours, she felt a quiet she hadn't realized she'd been longing for. The storm inside her had calmed, replaced by something steadier, something that hummed with quiet triumph and gentle pride. She leaned forward, running her fingers through Max's patchy coat, feeling the texture beneath her touch, soft in places, uneven in others, but real. Whole, in its own scarred way. The tactile memory grounded her, a reminder that healing was both immediate and gradual, jagged yet beautiful. Max lifted his head, eyes soft and trusting, and she smiled faintly, a weight lifting from her chest. "We made it," she whispered. The words were small but potent, carrying the enormity of grief transformed into courage. Outside, the world was wet but bright. Puddles reflected shards of sky, and the damp smell of earth mingled with the faint perfume of budding flowers, a promise of renewal. Filey stepped barefoot onto the porch, letting the warmth seep into her cold toes. The neighborhood felt different in the light of day. Not smaller, but safer, familiar again. She realized that fear had been temporary, a shadow that could be pushed back by presence, loyalty, and deliberate action. And she understood finally that her father's lessons weren't just about combat or survival. They were about life, about standing firm when the world tried to break you. Her mind wandered back to yesterday's confrontation, to the precise moment the bullies had faltered, to the low rumble of Max's growl that had spoken more than words ever could. She smiled faintly, remembering the fear and awe that had flickered across their faces. But more than that, she remembered her own heartbeat, her own voice, steady and resolute. Courage, she realized, wasn't something you inherited. It was something you earned, one deliberate choice at a time. Max nudged her hand, warm and insistent, and she leaned down, pressing her forehead against his damp fur. They had been through fear together, grief together, and now triumph together. And in the quiet aftermath, she felt the bond between them deepen into something unshakable. The small scars on his coat became symbols rather than injuries, markers of survival and resilience. She had thought loss might hollow her, but instead it had carved out space for courage, for clarity, for love that could not be diminished. The wind rustled through the trees, soft and deliberate, carrying the scent of rain-soaked leaves. Filey breathed deeply, letting it fill her lungs, and for a long moment, she allowed herself to feel relief without guilt, pride without arrogance. The storm had tested them both, and they had endured, and in that endurance there was a quiet beauty, almost sacred in its simplicity. She realized that protection wasn't about striking first or hitting hardest. It was about presence, attention, loyalty, and the unshakable willingness to act when it mattered most. Her father appeared then, stepping onto the porch with his familiar calm presence, raincoat still damp from yesterday's drizzle. His eyes met hers, warm and steady, and for a heartbeat they didn't speak. He crouched beside Max, ruffling the fur gently, and Filey felt the silent acknowledgement of everything they had both endured, the fear, the anger, the reckoning, and the triumph. "You did well," he said finally, voice low but heavy with approval. "Stronger than I knew." She felt a tremor of pride rise, mingling with relief, and let herself lean into it for just a moment, feeling the bond of family and trust extend beyond words. They stood together for a long while, the quiet of the morning wrapping around them. The neighborhood stirred slowly, life returning to its ordinary rhythm. A bird calling, the distant hum of tires on wet asphalt, the faint laughter of children who had not yet noticed that yesterday's cruelty had been met with consequence. Filey felt the weight of yesterday's events settle in a new shape, lighter, tempered, and full of meaning. Max nudged her hand again, insistent and warm, and she laughed softly, the sound clear and bright. "Ready for breakfast?" she asked, and the dog barked once in agreement, tail wagging like a pendulum marking the return of safety. They walked inside together, wet paws and bare toes leaving trails across the wooden floor, a small mess that mattered little in the grand scheme of survival, courage, and love. She paused in the kitchen doorway, glancing out the window at the wet, glimmering street, now washed clean by the rain. Shadows had receded, light had returned, and the world seemed softer, more forgiving. It wasn't perfect. The scars on Max's coat and in her heart would remain, small reminders of the cruelty they had endured. But the shadows no longer dominated. Courage, loyalty, and presence had won. She had learned something unshakable. Even after the storm, the light returns, and with it, the quiet strength to keep standing. Max nudged her again, and she bent to hug him, feeling the warmth of his body press against her. The world outside could wait. They had survived together. They had fought. They had endured. And in the lingering sunlight, in the quiet smell of rain and earth, in the softness of patched fur and steady heartbeat, Filey realized that safety, courage, and love weren't things given. They were things built, nurtured, defended, and treasured. She pressed a kiss to Max's head and whispered, "We'll face whatever comes next." Together, outside, the world gleamed with rain-washed clarity. Inside, her heart beat steady and unafraid. And for the first time since the day had begun with cruelty and fear, Filey felt whole, quiet, and invincible, not because the storm had passed, but because she had learned how to stand in it. The morning sunlight caught the remaining drops of rain on the leaves, turning them into tiny prisms of gold. Filey watched them glimmer, and for a long, perfect moment, she simply breathed, letting the calm and the light and the quiet victory wrap around her. The storm was over. The reckoning had passed, and she and Max together were unshakable.